Hello and welcome to a new episode of Academic Chat, your series dedicated to exploring academic concepts and topics related to the programs taught at Faculty of Governance, Economics, and Social Sciences. Peace is a fundamental aspiration shared by people worldwide. Yet, to achieve peace, countries and international organizations face constant challenges and complexities. From long-standing conflicts to emerging threats, the journey towards sustainable peace seems very challenging. How can we define peace? What do we mean by preventive diplomacy, peacemaking, and peace building? In what ways can international organizations and governments cooperate together in order to improve peace around the world? In this episode, we will attempt to address all these questions with our guest speaker, Norman Sempijja, Professor of Political Science and International Relations here at FGSES. But before, let's take a moment to hear from our students at UM6P Rabat campus on today's topic, Peace Studies. We'll be back afterwards.
Achieving sustainable peace requires adaptive conflict resolution strategies. In fact, leaders should be able to switch between different positions like appeasement, dominance, cooperation, or even competition. In fact, research shows when these methods or strategies are used thoughtfully, they provide more positive outcome. And understanding the consequences of over-relying on one single strategy is crucial. And together, when these strategies are used, they provide more fertile ground and an environment to achieve sustainable peace.
An Agenda for Peace, authored by former UN Secretary General Boutros Boutros-Ghali in 1992, significantly shaped the contemporary approaches to conflict resolution and peace building by introducing a comprehensive and integrated framework encompassing preventive diplomacy, peacemaking, peacekeeping, and post-conflict peace building. It emphasized the importance of addressing the root causes of conflicts, enhancing UN capacities, promoting human rights, and fostering international and regional cooperation, thus laying the groundwork for modern, multidimensional peace efforts.
From an international relations perspective, security refers to the absence of armed conflicts between states or non-state actors. It is a state of prosperity and security that promotes political, economic, and social development without any interference of power or violence or coercion. Except to say that in today's governance, achieving security could be very challenging to power structures, especially when it comes to conflicting interests and power imbalances.
Welcome back, and thank you to our students for these comments and insights that will allow us to open the discussion with our guest for today's episode, Professor Norman Sempijja. Professor, hello, and thank you for being with us today.
Thanks very much, Nouamane. Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to always speak to you and have some good discussions. Yeah.
It's a pleasure. Professor Sempijja, we often hear discussions revolving around positive and negative peace, attributed to the renowned peace expert Johan Galtung. Before we delve deep into our discussion, could you please provide us with an overview of how Galtung's ideas have shaped our understanding of peace and conflict prevention?
Thanks very much for that question. The idea of negative and positive peace obviously is academically has been attributed to Galtung, but I was reading somewhere and I found out that in 1953, Martin Luther King in the Birmingham jail wrote a letter, and he was talking about positive and negative peace. Similar kind of like arguments whereby he attributed negative peace to lack of tensions, while Galtung attributes negative peace to the lack of violence or the absence of violence. And then positive peace, according to Martin Luther King, he attributed it to the presence of social justice, while Galtung attributed it to the absence of structural and indirect violence. Now, if you look at the end of World War I and World War II, the focus primarily was on negative peace, whereby you end the fighting. And even during the Cold War period, again, the focus was trying to kind of like stop the fighting. And so Galtang in the 60s moved the debate further. Even I think Martin Luther before him had moved the debate further to look at the structural issues that affect peace. That you can have the cessation of hostilities, for example, in the case of North Korea and South Korea, but the countries are still at a state of war. And so even in the modern day situation whereby you have maybe an internal conflict, you need to deal with the things that have been leading to this violence. For example, structures of inequality, social injustices that exist in that particular society. I mean, some have attributed slavery to a form of structural violence. And so these are some of the issues that exist in societies that can actually continuously perpetuate violence. And sometimes there may not be direct confrontation between groups, but the structures which have been set up actually lead to compound effect or maybe even cascading effects on society. For example, the effect on mental illness or mental well-being of people, even early deaths, and even subserviency in some societies, in terms of race. If you look at apartheid, for example, that was a form of structural violence which excluded some people from certain aspects of society, like certain jobs and certain places, and it impacted on mental health and also access to certain things in society or certain goods in society. And so those are the kind of like issues we have with the idea of positive and negative peace.
Professor Sempijja, we cannot be talking about peace without bringing up an agenda for peace authored by former UN Secretary General Boutros Ghali in 1992, following the Cold War, where he explores preventive diplomacy. He talks also about peacemaking and peace building. Could you please walk us through the highlights of this report?
Thanks very much for that question. And actually, it kind of like moves directly from Galtang, and then we move into Boutros Ghali, who also kind of like develops mechanisms in trying to bring about positive peace in post-conflict situations. Because I think what Boutros Ghali faced in the 90s as Secretary General of the UN were conflicts which were breaking out in countries. And so having had the UN designed to deal with interstate conflicts, Boutros Ghali faced intrastate conflicts which didn't have international agreed norms on how to basically approach this form of violence, because obviously the idea of sovereignty was paramount to the people who constructed the UN Charter. And so ideas of, for example, peacekeeping had been brought up. The idea back then was to prevent the Cold War protagonists like the US and the USSR from getting involved in localized conflicts. So Boutros Ghali took the debate further. For example, he argued for preventive diplomacy, and then he talked about peacemaking. Now the idea is that we needed to move from peacemaking, which involved mediation, provision of good officers of the UN, and then after we've got a peace to keep, then peacekeepers would come in to pave the way for peace building. And with peace building, we are looking into the ideas of positive peace. And so here we're looking at issues around trying to build institutions of a country, to be able to provide services, but also justice to the communities, but also deal with the internal issues like the dialogue that may be needed between different parties or different communities to resolve a conflict. And there's also an economic dimension. So apart from political, we had an economic dimension whereby, again, the state is prepared, or the different sectors of the state are rebuilt to be able to sustain the country from an economic point of view. That's why peace building has been perceived in a neoliberal perspective in terms of setting up neoliberal structures to kind of like build a country from the bottom up. And so, again, maybe to go back a bit, so we have peacemaking, which involves mediation, negotiations, and then also we have peacekeeping, And this has been a bit fluid because now peacekeepers are also engaged in peace enforcement, and also we have peace building. And the dream had been that we move in kind of like a linear progression from one to the other to make sure that the state is rebuilt. And we've had a few successes of that. We've had, for example, Sierra Leone and Liberia, where the conflicts have ended. Or initially, I think we had Cambodia, which had a successful kind of like peacekeeping operation set up. Elections were held, and then the country has been able to turn back to normality. But apart from those few cases, I think there's been a struggle to kind of like apply these concepts properly in the current conflicts which are taking place. And so that's one of the challenges which has emerged, that the linear element has not really been working because we've been moving back and forth. And so, and going back again to, I think, the idea of peace and conflict resolution, here, I mean, it looked like a blueprint which would resolve the conflicts, but then it is being surpassed by the current dynamics of conflicts which are emerging today. But nevertheless, it has worked in some cases, and we've developed kind of like a system in place to resolve conflicts, at least from the 90s until maybe most recently. Yeah.
Well, Professor Sempijja, reflecting on past events and current events, today we're talking about non-armed conflicts, like emerging threats such as climate change, for instance. Reflecting on these events, don't you think, Professor, that we need to be rethinking all those concepts, peace building, peacemaking, peace in general? And in your opinion, what could be the alternative framework or strategies that can be efficient to have a lasting and sustainable peace?
Oh, thanks very much. And I think I maybe hinted on that in my previous answer. Basically, yeah, traditional peace building mechanisms are struggling, and I think some authors have argued that peace building has reached its limit, especially conceptually, but also in terms of applicability. Reason being that it has been overtaken by new types of conflicts or new conflict dynamics. And so it has become kind of like difficult to apply in the way it was envisaged. First and foremost, I think we've looked at it, like I mentioned earlier, that the idea was to look at this progression in terms of a linear point of view. So you move from peacemaking to peacekeeping to peace building. But what has happened is that groups have normally disintegrated. And so if you look at South Sudan, or if you look at Congo, the groups that sat at the peace, I'll take you to Congo, the groups that were present during maybe the 2002 Inter-Congolese dialogue that kicked off the peace building process are not the same today because now we have M23, FDLR has also gained a lot of kind of like clout in the conflict. And so right now I think there's an argument that there are over 120 groups fighting within the DRC. And so as we move from peacekeeping to progress, and we progress into peace building, the challenge was there was always a recourse to conflict. And so this linear progression has not really been successful. And that has impacted on the peace building processes. The other issue also is the question of who is involved in the peace building process, or what have we agreed as the peace building process. The challenge here is that what has happened is that peace building has been left to other groups which may not have been party to the conflict, and they come in to apply their perspectives of what they perceive as peace. And this has always negatively impacted on the whole process, and that's why, for example, we are having a continuous cycle of conflict in countries like the DRC. We've been unable to put into place a proper peace building process in Somalia, And I think South Sudan is also struggling. And so that is maybe one of the issues that we face there. What can be done? I think that going back to your question, and how can we address this? I think maybe what I can argue is that we should, when the peace is being negotiated, the desire is to end the fighting. But I think the finer details of a peace process or a peace agreement need to include how the peace building process is going to be carried out. Who are going to be the actors in the peace building process so that the parties know how this is going to be conducted. But also, we should not look at peace building as an event or something that happens once and then we all go home. It is a constant process that is always in play, which we should always be working on, trying to improve, especially as new actors emerge. Because like I mentioned earlier, in a peace process, groups are going to fragment. The group that may sign an agreement today may not be the same group which may be into play 5 years later. And so we need to have allowances for that. And so peacemakers and peace builders need to be in constant dialogue to make sure that the processes are interlinked, in that we are constantly making peace as we build, so that we don't let the peacemakers go away. Because when the conflict breaks out again, we have to invite them, and then they're going to find that the dynamics have changed. And so the peacemaking and peace building, including the peacekeeping, need to be in constant dialogue. And these processes need to be in constant dialogue with each other to make sure that we deal with any challenges that may come up in the process of the peace building process. But also lastly, involving local actors in the peace process. Like I mentioned earlier, they need to be part of the initial plan of the peace building, so that we don't apply something that is alien to them, and then they wait for us to leave, and then they go back to conflict.
Thank you, Professor. To our audience, thank you for being with us today and for joining us in another episode of Academic Chat. If you want to learn more about our events and upcoming activities, please visit our website on www.fgses.um6p.ma. We shall meet again very soon. Until then, keep seeking knowledge.